Hi, I'm Monica A. Coleman, and I want to share with you how I had questions of religion and found some answers. I found my answers in process theology. It's a theology of change. So I want to share with you how I came to that, because it wasn't a straight route, and why it's meaningful to me. I was just a person who grew up in church. I wasn't a religion major. I had no idea I wanted to grow up and be a religion scholar. I didn't even know that was an option. And I felt a call into ministry. And so I went to divinity school to learn more about my faith and to learn more about how to be a good minister. Turns out it's not going to teach you that. But I did get to learn a whole lot more about religion and society. I first encountered process theology as one of many books in an introductory theology course. And I didn't understand it at all. So I threw that book across the room in frustration and figured it must not be important. Not the best conclusion to come to, but that's where I was. Then my second year in school, I encountered process theology again in a different textbook, and I only understood it a little bit better. And I remember clearly thinking, why would I pray to a God that doesn't have the power to answer my prayers? I don't want that kind of God. And I threw the book across the room. That was how I responded to things I didn't like. Anyway, I encountered process theology a third time, and that was during my last year in divinity school. But a lot of life had happened to me between my first and my third encounters with process theology. In that time, I was raped by somebody I knew, loved, and trusted prior to the assault, like so many survivors of sexual violence. And I began my healing process in part by becoming an advocate and speaking out against sexual violence. I also began working with people who were involved in domestic violence, with victims of domestic violence and survivors of domestic violence. And as I wrestled with my own faith and with listening to the questions that were given by people I worked with, people I grew to know and love, I realized I didn't have answers. Because I kept asking, well, if God can part the Red Sea, why didn't God stop this from happening to me? I didn't have an answer to that. But I wasn't quite ready to give up on my faith either. So I was looking for answers. Likewise, people were asking me similar things. Why is this happening? Why am I suffering? Where is God? Why isn't God rescuing me? And I didn't have answers. I couldn't say, is part of God's plan? God let this happen for a reason? Even if I believed them, it just seemed cruel to say. And I wasn't so sure I believed it. But I didn't have any other answers. So I ended up in a course on preaching on themes of evil and suffering, because I figured I need to learn how to say something about this. And it was in that course where I read Charles Hartshorne's Omnipotence and Other Theological Mistakes. And the light bulb came on. I was like, yes, this is it. I have not been thinking about God's power in the most helpful ways. And there's another way to do it. And I felt like this seemed to make sense to me. This seemed to have an answer for me. So, let me investigate this. But the problem was I was graduating and I went into the workforce and I worked really long days and really long hours in nonprofit work for a couple years. But I would come home at night at 11 p.m. and try to read and understand those books that I had tossed across the room. I wanted to know more. They still didn't make a lot of sense. But I felt like there's something here. I think my answers are here. And so I left everything I knew and loved and moved to California so I could study at Claremont and learn more about process theology. Because that was one of the only places where you could learn about process theology in depth. And I had to read a whole lot of philosophy to get there. And that was not my strong suit. I'm much better at it now. And that was where I learned about this theology of change, about a very different way of thinking about God's power, about God's presence, about God's knowledge, in a way that wasn't affirming that God could have saved me and just chose not to. But that's just not what God does. In a way that affirmed for me that God was deeply present with me in my suffering. And that was deeply meaningful for me, and it gave me a lot of the answers that I was looking for. Well, not everyone has time to just drop everything you're doing and go to graduate school for a number of years. Nobody's got time for that. And when I read process theology, I also brought to it my commitments to justice and to liberation and to culture. But I was so excited to find this theology that affirmed my experiences and gave me a God that I could believe in again. And so that's what I'm wanting to offer to others without going all the way to Claremont and getting a graduate degree. We ought to have a chance to learn about another option, something that might help us stay in our faith when we're not getting our questions